around 30 AD, in the course of a discussion with his closest followers, Jesus declared, among other things, "Did you think that I came to bring peace to the world? No, but rather division." A generation or two later, sometime late in the first century, Luke recorded Jesus' words in his gospel. 1800 years after that, in April of 1857, a publication called the National Telegraphic Review and Operator's Guide, which was the go-to guide for professional telegraphers, prescribed the use of the Morse code group of the number 73 as code for the phrase "love and kisses" at the end of the message. In case you're wondering what that sounded like, you heard that at the end of a message. Somebody who knew Morse code knew that meant love and kisses. And 105 years after that, a gentleman by the name of Scott Fallman, who was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, proposed using a colon, a dash, and a right parenthesis to stand for a smile, and a colon, dash, and a left parenthesis to stand for a frowning face when people were leaving text messages on the school server. That way, somebody reading the message would know if you were telling a joke or if you were sad about something. And what I plan to do this morning is to show you how all of these things are related and why it matters. Now, if you're like me, I'm sorry. But also, when you read or heard today's gospel lesson, you may have thought, wow, that just doesn't sound much like the Jesus that we know and love from other parts of the gospel. We have the image of a shepherd Jesus, or a teaching Jesus, or a healing Jesus, or, the miracle-working Jesus. That's what we tend to remember and what we take away from the gospel that we have studied in the course of our lives. Even back there somewhere is the Jesus who kind of flipped out a little bit in the temple and was turning over tables and chasing out money changers with whips. That's part of our image of Jesus, although that one makes us a little uncomfortable maybe. But here we seem to have Jesus completely junking the message of peace and love and harmony, and instead saying, "I came to bring fire to the earth. And how I wish it was already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and how I wish it was already over. Man, I am stressed. I've come to bring division, not peace. From now on, households are going to be divided against themselves, and there will be conflict." And we look back and we read this, and it wouldn't be surprising if we thought, wow, when did the mission change exactly? When did peace, hope, and love get replaced by anxiety, division, and conflict? What Jesus was teaching. And then this week, as I read this, and I thought about it, and I did some other reading, and I tried to put everything into a context that I could understand, I had a realization. And my realization was that maybe the mission and the message hadn't changed. Maybe the difficulty wasn't with the message, but it was with the medium. First, I want to give you a little bit of context. 'Context. 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 ' Remember, Jesus said, I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. And we look back, and it seems like a curious thing to say, since we know that Jesus was already baptized. At the beginning of his ministry, John baptized him. So why is he talking about it having to be done? And even if what he means is getting baptized again, what's there to stress about? You know, you go down in the river, you get dunked, and you come up, and it's over. And the answer, of course, is that it really means more than that, because you look at words as they're used back then. In broad terms, baptism, it could be thought of as just as a rite or an event that has to happen before something else can take place. And Jesus, who is now in full knowledge of his future, when he talked about this baptism that was coming, he was talking about his own suffering and death. Just as we believe that water baptism marks a restoration of the relationship between God and the person who is being baptized, just as the water represents the pouring out of God's grace upon that person, and the laying on of hands represents the raising up of that person into a new, restored relationship with God, so the death of Jesus was going to mark the restoration of a relationship between God and the rest of humanity. That's the promise. The promise of that baptism of death and resurrection was resurrection and new life. But the idea of that baptism scared Jesus almost out of his wits, because the idea of being betrayed and abandoned by his own followers, his closest friends, the idea of being tortured and humiliated and ultimately killed in what was one of the most intentionally painful ways to kill a person that could be devised. Who wouldn't be scared by that? Who wouldn't look ahead to that and be stressed? Jesus was fully human. He was blessed with a human being's imagination, and that took him to a very, very dark place in his soul, no matter what was promised on the other side of that. Getting through it was going to be a horrific event. And yet there was the promise of what would come later. Just as the promise of restoration and salvation are ours when we are baptized, the promise of resurrection and restoration to his rightful place in God's kingdom was there for Jesus after his baptism. And to top it all off, because Jesus was fully human, he knew that human beings, being who they were, meant that it was not all going to be perfect when he did walk out of that tomb. He knew that human beings, being who they were not all going to accept the gift of salvation that he made possible by going through that baptism. So he was going to suffer and die. And there would still be people who said, not my thing. Some people wouldn't believe everything he'd been teaching. Some people would try to put it off to the last minute and then discover that that last minute came a little sooner than they'd expected. And he could look beyond that even, and he would know that there was going to be conflict and disagreement, and eventually in the history of the church there was going to be full-fledged war over how to interpret and implement his message of peace and love. I think the irony was a little too much. And I think that's what Jesus was referring to at the top of this week's gospel lesson. It wasn't, a fire and brimstone message. It wasn't saying, I'm here to bring fire and conflict. It was really a message of sorrow and pity. Recognizing what was going to happen because of his presence. Only it's really hard to get that from just reading text. Let alone reading text that was written 2,000 years ago in a different language, being translated from another language. It's almost impossible. According to studies conducted by a Dr. Albert Merabian, that name will be on the test, only about 7% of any message is received through the words of the message. 7%. 38% of the message is received from the vocal elements. The tone of voice, your inflections, things like that. And 55% of a message comes from nonverbal elements, facial expressions, body language, what the person looks like and what they're saying, what they're doing while they're saying it. And that's why communicating by text alone, just by writing, is so darn tricky. Because you can't hear tone and you can't see expressions. We've discovered that in this digital age where we text one another and email one another way more than we used to, maybe way more than talking even. And Scott Fahlman, our friend from Carnegie Mellon University that we talked about early on, he saw this coming. So he borrowed from the National Telegraphic Review and Operator's Guide the idea of substituting a quick code to convey emotion. He created the first emoticons. All those things you see on Facebook now, the smiley faces and the frowny faces and the angry faces, little piles of poop. See more of those in the political arguments. All of that goes back to this guy. Emoticons or emojis are our attempt to add tone to the written word. They're our attempt to convey nonverbal information to help someone understand what we have just written. Now to go tie this back to Luke. After reading and studying, as I mentioned, I'm pretty sure Jesus wasn't, pounding the table and saying angrily that he was here to bring fire and division. He was just acknowledging that he was this storm front moving through. We can kind of appreciate it today. Jesus knew that the world was going to be changing after he went through his baptism. He knew that the world was going to change after his death and resurrection because the world wasn't going to know how to react to it. Some people would welcome the good news, they would welcome the gospel, they'd embrace it, and come to God's kingdom with joy, and others would fight it. Within households, members of the same family would have different understandings. Jesus, if he was writing in today's medium, or I should say probably Luke, Jesus wouldn't have written it. If Luke was writing in today's media after he wrote, "Did you think I came to bring peace to the earth? No, I am bringing division and conflict." I think Luke maybe would have included a sad emoji to show that what Jesus had said was an acknowledgement of the conflict. Not that he brought it, that it would happen. It makes me think it would be a lot easier if we had a translation of the Bible where there were emojis. I'm putting that out there for anybody that wants to do it. And of course, it made me wonder if Jesus today, like so many other important people, if Jesus had a Twitter account, what kind of emojis do you think he'd be using when he wrote about what he sees today? What kind of emojis do you think he'd be using when he looked at what the church was doing and going through? Smiley faces? Sad faces? Frowny faces? I would like to think that Jesus would look at us and see that we are living out his words of peace and joy and hope. I'd like to think we'd get a smiley face. I think that's something to strive for. And I really think that we are. Because we are agents of God's grace. And we too have promises to keep in this world. Amen.
Amen.